Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're doing something a little different. We're going to really dig into how we talk about those everyday routines in English. You know, those things we all do. You'll learn phrases you can use right away. Plus, we'll look at some of the key grammar. And who knows, we might even discover how routines can be a window into different cultures.
It's amazing how even something as simple as getting ready for work can show you those subtle cultural differences.
Okay, so let's jump right in with morning routines. We all wake up, but how we talk about it can be surprisingly varied, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think about the difference between getting out of bed versus rolling out of bed. I mean, get is pretty straightforward, but roll kind of suggests, a more relaxed start to the day. Maybe even a little reluctant, huh? Paints a little picture.
It's like you're adding flavor to your English. And what about when we talk about breakfast? The sources mention have breakfast versus eat breakfast. Does it matter which one I use?
Not really. Both are totally fine grammatically. Have is maybe more common, in everyday conversations. And eat might sound a bit more formal, but honestly, you'll hear native speakers use both pretty interchangeably.
So it's all about finding what feels natural for you.
Yeah.
Okay, but here's something that always tripped me up when I was first learning English. Why do all the examples in the sources use the present simple tense?
Ah, that's a great question. So the present simple is kind of like your go-to tense when you're talking about habits and routines. It's like saying, this is what I do regularly, right?
Yeah.
So you wouldn't say, I am waking up now. You'd say, I wake up at 7 a.m. to describe your routine.
Makes total sense.
Mhm.
It's about the big picture, not just this one specific morning. Speaking of I noticed a lot of first-person examples. Is that important?
Well, it's natural to use I when you're describing your own routine, right? Because it's about you. Of course, you can also describe someone else's routine using he, she, or they.
So it just depends on the perspective. Like, he always grabs coffee on his way to work
Mm.
versus, I prefer to make tea at home.
Exactly. And did you notice how we're using those adverbs of frequency? Those always, usually, sometimes, never. They add those details that paint a richer picture.
Yeah, they're super useful. But honestly, telling time in English used to really confuse me. Like, when do I use at versus around with times?
That's a great point. At is usually for precise times, like I wake up at 7 a.m. But around suggests it can be a bit more flexible, like I have breakfast around 8 a.m., meaning it could be a bit earlier or later.
It's like a built-in buffer for that snooze button. One thing that really fascinated me in the sources was this idea that even something as basic as a morning routine can be totally different across cultures.
Yeah, that's where language becomes more than just words. It gives you a glimpse into how other people live. Like in some cultures, breakfast is a super quick thing, and in others, it's this big family gathering.
And that even affects the vocabulary, right? Like
Right.
grabbing a coffee on the go versus like sitting down for a leisurely breakfast.
Exactly. It's not just about what you're doing, it's about those values around it.
So learning the language also means learning about the culture behind it. Now, speaking of different parts of the day, let's move on from those cozy mornings and talk about work or school routines. What phrases come to mind when we think about that part of the day?
Well, if you're in an office, you'll probably hear people talking about checking emails, attending meetings, and working on projects.
So if I'm a student, my vocabulary is going to be different.
Absolutely. You'd be attending classes, taking notes, studying for exams, and maybe even pulling an all-nighter.
Oh, I remember those days.
Yeah.
But even if the specific tasks are different, there are some things we all do, like having lunch. I noticed the sources use different phrases. Have lunch, go for lunch, take a lunch break. Is there like a subtle difference there?
You're really picking up on those nuances. Have lunch is the most general term. Go for lunch implies leaving your workspace.
Mhm.
And take a lunch break emphasizes the pause in your workday.
So choosing the right phrase can even signal something about how you approach work.
Exactly. And that shows how even small phrases can have those deeper cultural meanings, right?
So interesting. And speaking of cultural differences,
Mm.
I'm curious about how routines in the workday vary across cultures.
Oh, definitely. One example is the idea of a tea break in some cultures. It's a dedicated time for socializing and having a hot drink, which might be unheard of in other work cultures.
It's amazing how these routines can reflect different values around work, rest, and social
You
interaction.
got it. Understanding those differences can be super important for communication, especially when you're working with people from different cultures.
It's like having a secret decoder ring.
Hmm.
Okay, we've talked about mornings and the workday. But what about evenings? What vocab comes up when we talk about those evening routines?
Well, evenings are all about winding down, right? Going from work or school to that leisure time, you'll hear phrases like cook dinner, watch TV, read a book, and of course, go to bed.
And within those broader categories, there's a lot of room for nuance, huh?
Yeah, for sure. Like instead of cook dinner, you could say whip up a quick meal, or maybe spend hours preparing a gourmet feast.
It's like choosing the right filter for that Instagram story of dinner. And what about those little actions, the things that make up a whole evening routine? The sources mention stuff like take a shower, brush your teeth, put on pajamas.
Right. For lots of people, it's like a ritual. And those rituals can vary a lot across cultures. Think about it. The order of those actions, the time spent on each one, even the products used can be influenced by cultural norms.
I never thought about it that way. It's amazing how those little details can reveal so much about a culture. Before we move on, did you notice how the sources talked about using time markers? Like before, after, then, and finally, when they described evening routines.
Yeah, those are important for making things clear. Like you're creating a timeline so your listener can follow along. It's the difference between a random list of activities and a story about your evening.
So instead of just saying, I eat, watch TV, and sleep, I could say something like, after dinner, I usually relax by watching some TV. Then, I brush my teeth and finally head to bed.
Exactly. It's way smoother and easier to understand.
This is making me rethink how I talk about my own day.
Mhm.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to hear more about those cultural differences in evening routines. What are some examples that stood out to you?
Well, one interesting example is how different cultures approach family time. In some cultures, a formal family dinner is really common, while in others, families might eat at different times and come together for other activities later.
And that would totally change how people talk about it. Like, we always have a family dinner at 7 p.m. versus we usually catch up with each other in the evenings, while doing our own thing.
Yeah, exactly. Those little choices can tell you a lot about the values and how people structure their time.
It's like each phrase is a tiny window into a different world.
That's what's so cool about exploring daily routines, right? It's not just about the words, but about the whole culture they represent.
Well said. This deep dive is already changing how I think about language and culture. Now, before we move on to the final part of our exploration, let's take a pause and think about what we've learned so far. We've covered so much, from basic phrases to those deeper cultural insights, and I'm definitely feeling energized and ready to explore even more.
Me too. Welcome back to our deep dive. We're really getting into the nitty-gritty of daily routines in English.
I'm loving it. We've talked about mornings and work or school,
Mm,
but now I want to unpack those evening routines. Is it true that even how we relax can be different across cultures?
you bet. Even leisure time can be structured. I mean, think about your typical evening. You probably have a flow, even if it's not as rigid as your workday.
Hmm. Now that you mention it, yeah, there is a flow to it. But the activities themselves could be totally different depending on where you live, huh?
Oh, for sure. And the language we use to describe those activities, it can actually tell you a lot about cultural values and lifestyles. For example, in some cultures, evenings are all about those big family gatherings, while in other cultures, people might prefer quiet time alone or hanging out with just a few close friends.
That makes me wonder, what are some of the common phrases we use in English to describe those different ways of spending our evenings?
Well, like we talked about earlier, cooking dinner is a classic, but you might also hear ordering takeout, especially if someone's not feeling up to cooking right, or having dinner with family if that's a big part of their routine.
And after dinner, the possibilities are pretty much endless. The sources mentioned everything from watching TV and reading a book to going for a walk or catching up with friends.
Mm,
It seems like it's all about finding ways to unwind and recharge.
absolutely. And even within those broader categories, there's so many variations. Like under watching TV, you could be watching a movie, binge watching a TV series, or catching up on the news.
It's kind of like those subcategories you see on streaming services. So many choices. It really shows you how rich the English language is, even when we're just talking about everyday things.
And that richness lets you be more precise. You can really paint a clear picture with your words.
Speaking of vivid pictures, I was struck by how much detail the sources use to describe those little things, like getting ready for bed. Phrases like taking a shower, having a bath, brushing your teeth, putting on pajamas. It's like a whole bedtime ritual.
It is for many people, and those rituals can be so different from culture to culture. In some places, taking a bath is this long, luxurious thing, and in other places, it's more about getting clean quickly. The way
Wow.
people describe it reflects those differences.
It's fascinating. I can totally see how someone might say, like, I like to pamper myself with a hot bath before bed, while someone else might say, I just take a quick shower to save time.
Exactly. And those little phrases can say a lot about a person, their personality, their background, even their values.
It makes you realize how much thought goes into even the simplest things we say.
For sure. It's what I love about language. It's not just communication, it's a reflection of who we are.
Yeah, before we get to those advanced vocabulary tips, I want to circle back to something the sources talked about.
Mm.
The importance of using time markers when you're describing evening routines.
Right, those little words like before, after, then, and finally, they're like signposts. They help your listener understand what happens when.
So instead of just saying, I cook dinner, watch TV, and go to bed, I could say, after I get home from work, I usually cook dinner. Then I relax by watching some TV. Finally, I brush my teeth and head to bed.
Exactly. It's much clearer and more engaging.
It's like the difference between reading a random list of ingredients
Mm,
and following a recipe.
you got it.
Those time markers give you that sense of order in how things unfold.
It's essential when you're talking about routines. It highlights that sense of structure and predictability.
It makes me realize how much impact those little words can have. Now, before we go to the final part of our deep dive, I want to come back to those cultural differences in evening routines. Are there any examples that really show how these differences play out?
One that comes to mind is socializing. In some cultures, it's common to meet friends after work for drinks or dinner. In other cultures, evenings are more about family or just relaxing at home.
And I bet those different approaches would be reflected in how people talk about their evenings. Someone from one culture might say, I love catching up with friends over a pint after work. And someone from another culture might say, I prefer to unwind at home with a good book.
Exactly. Simple statements, but they reveal a lot about cultural norms and personal preferences.
It's like each phrase is a peek into a different world.
That's the magic of language, right? It lets us see things from different perspectives.
It's making me see language in a whole new light. It's not just about grammar and vocab. It's about how we experience the world.
And as you continue to explore English, you'll find even more of those fascinating connections between language, culture, and just being human.
This deep dive has been incredible. But I want to take my fluency to the next level. What kind of advanced vocab and grammar tips can help me really nail those descriptions of daily routines?
Well, one powerful tool is adverbs of frequency. Words like always, usually, often, sometimes, rarely, and never. They tell you how often you do something.
So instead of just saying, I go to the gym, I could say, I usually go to the gym 3 times a week.
Exactly. That usually gives you more detail.
It's not just stating the fact, it's giving extra information about my habits.
Exactly. Or you could say, I sometimes skip the gym if I'm feeling tired.
Which makes me sound more relatable, right? Not like some kind of fitness robot.
Right.
So the right adverb can really change the whole tone.
That's why they're so important. They let you express yourself with more nuance.
It's like you're painting a more complete picture. I'm already thinking about how I can use them in my conversations. What about those phrasal verbs you mentioned earlier? Those always seem kind of tricky.
Yeah, they can be tricky because their meaning isn't always clear from the individual words. But that's what makes them interesting. They make your language more colorful and idiomatic.
So instead of saying, I wake up, I could say, I get up.
Exactly. Get up is more casual. Wake up is more neutral.
And sometimes they have completely different meanings, right?
Right. Think about look up and look up to. Look up means to search for something. Look up to means to admire someone.
Those small differences can really change things.
Right.
I want to start collecting phrasal verbs.
The best way to learn them is to listen to how native speakers use them. Watch movies, listen to music, read books. The more you immerse yourself, the more natural they'll sound.
I love that. What about prepositions? Are there any tips for those?
One helpful tip is to think about prepositions as relationships. In often shows location or time.
Yeah.
On often shows contact or position.
So I am in the house, but the book is on the table.
Exactly. And for time, we use at for specific times. In for parts of the day, months, and years. And on for days and dates.
It makes so much more sense now.
It's all about understanding the logic, not just memorizing rules.
This deep dive has been so helpful.
I'm glad to hear it.
I feel more confident about my English.
That's great.
And remember, language learning never really ends.
Right.
There's always something new to learn.
Exactly.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've gone from basic vocabulary to advanced techniques. I hope our listeners are feeling inspired to keep practicing.
Me too. Remember to stay curious, keep practicing, and enjoy those aha moments.
That's the best part.
Language learning is full of possibilities.
Beautifully said.
Mhm.
To our listeners, keep exploring and experimenting with English. We'll see you on the next deep dive.
Welcome back to the deep dive.
It feels like we've covered a ton already, but I'm excited to try out those advanced techniques you talked about.
They're not about making things more complicated. It's about adding those subtle touches, nuance, precision, even a bit of artistry.
That's what I'm going for. Let's start with those adverbs of frequency. I know we touched on them, but I want to really get how to use them strategically.
Okay, so let's say you're talking about going to the gym. Instead of just, I go to the gym, you could say, I always go to the gym after work.
Right.
That always shows how consistent you are.
So it's not just about the action itself. It's about giving extra information about my habits.
Exactly. You could also say, I sometimes skip the gym if I'm feeling tired.
That's definitely me.
That sometimes adds a bit of balance,
Makes you sound more human, less like a gym robot.
Right.
So the right adverb can change the whole vibe of what you're saying.
Exactly. That's why they're so powerful.
Okay, I'm getting it.
Hmm.
What about phrasal verbs? Those still seem kind of tricky to me.
They can be, because the meaning isn't always obvious from the individual words. But that's what makes them fun, right? They make your English sound more natural and idiomatic.
So like instead of I wake up, I could say I get up.
Right. Get up is more casual.
And sometimes phrasal verbs have totally different meanings.
Yeah, like look up and look up to. Look up is to search for something, but look up to is to admire someone.
Wow, those are tricky.
The best way to learn them is to hear them in action. Pay attention when you're watching movies or listening to music.
So it's all about immersing yourself in the language.
Exactly.
What about prepositions? Any tips for those?
Think of prepositions as relationships between things.
Ah.
In often means location or time. On often means contact. So
Okay.
you'd say, I am in the house.
Yeah.
But the book is on the table.
Got it.
And with time, at is for specific times. In is for parts of the day, months, years. On is for days and dates.
I'm starting to see the patterns.
It's all about those connections.
This has been such a helpful deep dive. I
Yeah.
feel way more confident about my English now.
That's great to hear.
And I know there's always more to learn. Language learning never really ends, does it?
Yep.
Well, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. We've covered so much ground, from basic vocabulary to those more advanced techniques. I hope everyone listening is feeling inspired to keep practicing.
Me too. Stay curious, keep practicing, and most importantly, have fun with it.
Exactly.
There's a whole world of language out there to explore.
Well said. To all our listeners out there, keep diving deep into English. We'll see you on the next deep dive.